We have much to remember today, and the stories I will share are hard stories. But they are our stories, part of who we are. George Floyd was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina on October 14th, 1973. If he were alive today, he would be 47 years old, 4 years my junior, if he were alive. There are those who say the world today is different because of George Floyd's death, that we are learning how to face the truth of inequality in the United States. I pray that those people are right, while I acknowledge that this task is far more complex than we have ever imagined. I can't breathe is not a cry for justice. It is a plea for humanity. Justice is several long steps down the line from I can't breathe. This week marks a year since Floyd's murder, a year without him telling teens in his neighborhood that he loves them, and so does God. A year without him admitting to imperfection and mistakes in his past while trying to help those around him. A year without his human presence in the life of his family. Derek Chauvin was not alone in killing George Floyd. And I'm not talking about the officers with him that day. I'm talking about our collective past. The reality of the systems at work around us and the ways they simply have not changed as time has marched forward and so much of our world has shifted. This week marks the centennial of another day, a day when violence destroyed an entire community and when perpetrators faced no consequences, when systems and institutions were complicit in murder, and when people of color died in ways that we associate with wars in far-off countries. Tomorrow will be the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I want to tell you about that day. And I hope to, in that telling, make clear why when we talk about becoming an anti-racist church, an anti-racist denomination, and anti-racist society, using diversity as a goal is simply insufficient. So here we go. A trip into the past in Oklahoma in order to understand our present and chart a better future. Oklahoma was incredibly diverse. Before it became a state, Oklahoma was dominated by Native Americans, many of whom were moved there by U.S. policy. There was also a significant African American population who had left the threat of slavery on the East Coast. There were also white settlers who had pushed the frontier seeking what they thought of as unclaimed land. The discovery of oil brought more whites in at the end of the 19th century, and all three groups benefited financially from the oil boom to some degree. All three groups lived in and around Tulsa, which was governed largely by frontier justice. Oklahoma became a state, and the new white leadership instituted some of the most draconian segregation policies in the entire country during the very first meeting of its legislature. In the city of Tulsa, this played out as the development of strictly segregated neighborhoods, much as we find in the history of many U.S. cities. The white establishment, led by the editors of the Tulsa Tribune, complained bitterly about what they described as lawlessness in Greenwood, the city's African American district, and home to the business district that has since been dubbed Black Wall Street. On May 31st, 1921, an African American man exited an elevator in a white department store in downtown Tulsa. The store was the only establishment downtown that allowed African Americans to use restrooms. When he left the elevator, something happened. Most accounts now speculate that he stepped on the foot of the young woman who was working as the elevator attendant. She screamed. People came running, and Dick Rowland was eventually taken into custody for assaulting Sarah Page. What you may not know is that the legal term assault was also code for rape at this time. The Tulsa Tribune stoked the flames of fear with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." Rowland was taken to jail. Now, Tulsa specifically had a record of failing to protect suspects. Lynching was not uncommon. As direct evidence to that possibility, you should know that in 1920, a white prisoner was removed from the Tulsa jail and hung before any legal proceedings could take place. In light of this record, Greenwood residents became concerned when a white mob gathered outside of the Tulsa jail. An editorial in the Tulsa Tribune contributed the warning to lynch Negro tonight. African American veterans of World War I responded to the increasingly threatening mob by taking their service weapons to stand between the mob and the jail. An altercation ensued. A gun went off. And thus began 36 hours of what has been called the single worst incident of racial violence in the United States. A white mob flooded Greenwood, shooting people on sight, setting buildings on fire, and according to multiple survivors, dropping firebombs from planes overhead. These accounts have been overlooked by history books that describe Pearl Harbor as the only, or at least the first, attack by combat planes on U.S. soil. These events in Tulsa were recently dramatized in the HBO series The Watchmen. They are also described in the Oklahoma Commission on Race Riot Report of 2001. You can find accounts in articles featured in the Washington Post and the New York Times and several other news outlets, particularly this year, but also stretching back over the last couple of years around this day. About 35 blocks of homes and businesses were completely demolished, burned to the ground, with only metal bed frames still standing amongst the ashes. Official estimates of the death toll range between 1 and 300 victims. Recently confirmed mass graves challenge the accuracy of that count. 10,000 African Americans were made homeless that day. I could go on with further heartbreaking detail, but in the interest of time, I will simply add that insurance companies and Tulsa legislators made every effort to ensure that Greenwood would not be restored. When the neighborhood did, over the course of about 40 years, recover to a degree and began to support many Black-owned businesses and residences once again, the neighborhood was claimed by eminent domain and razed to make way for highways. Now, redevelopment and zoning limit prospects for Black business in Greenwood. The Tulsa Massacre has been systematically downplayed over the years, to the point that the inflaming editorial disappeared from nearly all historically archived copies of the Tulsa Tribune. The massacre was not taught in history classes in Oklahoma. And when it was taught in other states, I can tell you from experience teaching high school U.S. history that the massacre was subsumed under a larger category of race riots that occurred in several locations in 1919 as African American veterans returned from fighting for freedom in Europe to find that they still didn't have any at home. The Tulsa Race Massacre was not a riot. It happened. It was deadly. Tulsa residents are still begging for a complete account of what occurred during those 36 hours. Tulsa residents still wait for an admission of some level of responsibility by the family of the author of that inflammatory set of articles in the Tulsa Tribune. The author of those articles was Richard Lloyd Jones, son of revered Unitarian preacher and activist Jenkin Lloyd Jones, the founder of All Souls Unitarian in Chicago and responsible for a great deal of Unitarian growth in the Midwest. Richard Lloyd Jones was, in addition to being a newspaperman, the founder of All Souls Unitarian Church, Tulsa. The largest UU church in the United States, was founded by someone with at least partial responsibility in inciting the most deadly single racial incident in the history of our country. As the years went by, Jones's church, All Souls Tulsa, grew and grew and grew. In 2008, the nearly all-white congregation was joined by higher dimensions worship under the leadership of Bishop Carlton Pearson, about whom there's a Netflix documentary called Come Sunday. Pearson had been mentored by Oral Roberts and had a significant following in the African American evangelical Pentecostal tradition until he began to preach universal reconciliation, meaning that everyone was saved by God. He said hell is made here on earth by our hatred. Pearson was dubbed a heretic by his faith tradition, but he and his followers eventually responded to the invitation of Marlon Lavenhar, senior minister at All Souls Unitarian, to join them as a congregation in community. All Souls no longer had to ask themselves how to get more people of color to come to their church. It was magic. They were diverse. They were together in one space with excellent and committed leadership, assuring both groups of congregants that this was a good move for everyone. For many folks, this is where the story would end. When diversity is the goal, all we need to do is occupy the same space. We've done our work when our numbers change, when the photograph of our congregation reflects the kind of inclusive community we believe in. But what the folks in Tulsa discovered is that being together in the same building is not enough. Why is togetherness not enough? It's not enough because of everything that came before that moment. It's not enough because of our collective history being full of betrayal, violence, and institutions created by people who participated in betrayal and violence. It's not enough because many of our behaviors, expectations, and cultural norms have grown out of or with that betrayal and violence. We have all lost who we are as individuals in the construction and maintenance of white supremacy as a system that divides us into two separate groups, blurring everything that makes us different and amazing as individuals, and that keeps us separate through institutional realities that make it hard, even on a good day, to see one another's point of view quickly. These are just a few reasons that being together, diversity, is not enough and should not be the point. Being in the same space at All Souls quickly led to hurt feelings, to discomfort, to questions about theology, tradition, music, you name it. The incidents that arose led to the loss of congregation members from both communities and questions about whether new leadership might be required. It is 14 years after the merge, 100 years after the massacre, and All Souls Tulsa is preparing for a construction project that will put them back in downtown Tulsa, in a spot that bridges Greenwood and the rest of the city. As a community, they are persisting with a steadfast commitment that they call love beyond belief. What does that look like? I can tell you what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like compromise. It doesn't look like a community where those who have been there the longest keep things just as they've always been. It doesn't look like always seeking out what we have in common. So what does it look like? At All Souls, it looks like having programming that meets the different needs of congregants of color and white congregants. Time to discuss issues of race in a space that is safe and supportive. It looks like a robust pastoral care program steeped in best practices related to institutionalized racism and trauma. It looks like taking the time to have tedious planning conversations, maybe even more tedious than average, in an attempt to make sure all perspectives are considered. It looks like dedicated time for all of our sources, and sharing an understanding that if one sermon, service, or program is not really your cup of tea, it may be medicine for someone else. It looks like staying at the table, even when things are uncomfortable. And I lay that out there for long-term consideration. But what we all do inside of our churches is really only a small part of the point. The point is not diversity, and it's not just how to have an anti-racist church. The point is being anti-racist people in the world. It's being ourselves, each and every diverse one, and accepting those differences not because we are all the same deep down, but because we represent such wondrous variety. Anti-racism offers the gift of rediscovering and redefining who we all are as we dismantle our current systems and the ways of thinking that come from them. The January before last, my last in-person visit to school, classmates put together a service in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During the course of that service, a colleague revealed she had recently discovered that her family of Unitarians included slave owners. She was shocked. She was horrified. And then she did some thinking. She thought about what to do now, to consider what she could do to heal her own family's legacy. She wanted to do what it takes to get beyond diversity, sharing space. And what she came up with, a list for working on anti-racism, feels a lot like what it might mean to move through our racialized culture with love beyond belief. I thought I'd share my version of her words with you on this 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, 1 year after the murder of George Floyd. These are words and work for healing and loving. 6 habits to stay in right relation to the reality of racism in America. 1, learn the history of our country that I was not taught in school. 2, seek out contemporary stories, the experiences of people who are classified as other from me, and therefore experience the world very differently than I do. Believe them. Believe them. 4, make it a habit to take direction from and follow the leadership of people who have been historically marginalized. Refuse to allow phrases and slogans that give me pause to prevent me from listening to the whole story, idea, proposal, or campaign. 5, rescue my ethnicity from generic whiteness. By learning about and expressing the culture of my specific European heritage, I help break down the supremacy and normalization of generic white culture. Euro-American people have ethnicity. It's not white. 6, actively engage with the dismantling of society's structures of oppression and actively construct new systems of reparation that will eventually lead to equity. This list of habits is obviously not exhaustive, and it's my adaptation of a colleague's list, twice removed from you. Your list may be different. Maybe some of it is the same. Maybe, like me, you'd stopped considering your own ethnicity and how it's been subsumed as generic whiteness. Maybe you would also be surprised to find that most folks don't serve sauerkraut with turkey. There is liberation in moving toward genuine multicultural and anti-racist society for all of us. There is real acceptance for all difference when we stop making everyone the same in order to occupy the same space. There is a whole world of growth and exploration when we move from the goal of counting with diversity to the goal of knowing, accepting, acting, and loving beyond belief in community and in the world. May it be so. Spirit of life, of all that is holy, remind us this day and every day of the losses and grief of yesterday, that we might comfort, care, and build a better world. There is no heaven but on earth, and the ones who will make it are the ones who have hands with which to hug, hold, build, and vote, and ears and the presence of mind with which to listen deeply and with great love. May we always bring the light of the God of our understanding to shine in the dark places, and to use that knowledge for the betterment of humanity. Dear friends, may peace be with you in the week to come, born by your willingness to act and grow in accordance with your most sacred values. Amen.